Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I'm James Anno, Associate Curator of European Art here at the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston, and I'm also the curator in charge of our exhibition, Glory of Spain, Treasures from the Hispanic Society Museum and Library, which opened today. It's my pleasure this afternoon to introduce our speaker, Dr. Mitchell Codding. Dr. Codding is Executive Director and President of the Hispanic Society Museum and Library, located on Audubon Terrace in Upper Manhattan, New York. The Hispanic Society arguably boasts the greatest collection of Hispanic art outside of Spain in America, or perhaps even in the world, with more than 750,000 objects in its collection, spanning more than 4,000 years of art and culture. Dr. Codding has been Executive Director and President of the Hispanic Society since 1995, and before that, he was Assistant Director of the Hispanic Society from 1984 to 1995. Dr. Codding commands expert knowledge of the Hispanic Society's collections and is a leading scholar in the field. Dr. Codding has also made major acquisitions in all areas of the collections of his museum, and most notably has expanded the collection of fine and decorative arts from the Spanish Americas and 19th century Latin America. For his many contributions to the Hispanic art and culture, Dr. Codding was decorated with Spain's Order of Isabella the Catholic in 2010, which was a great honor indeed. I thank Dr. Codding for lending to the MFAH over 220 of the Hispanic Society's greatest masterpieces presented in our exhibition, Glory of Spain. And we're thrilled that Dr. Codding is here to speak with us about the history of the Hispanic Society, its founder, Archer Huntington, as well as the shape and nature of the collection. So please join me in giving Dr. Codding a very warm Houston welcome.
Thank you so much for being here this afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here in Houston for this, and we're at the Hispanic Society. We're absolutely thrilled with having the opportunity to be able to present the exhibition here in Houston. We hope, if you haven't seen it yet, I hope you go through it soon. This afternoon, I'm really certainly going to talk about the history of how everything came to pass and how the Hispanic Society was created and how the collections were formed over the years. No other, as James was sort of suggesting, no other institution in the world, even in Spain, can offer such a global vision of Spanish history, art, and culture spanning more than 4,000 years. The museum collection comprises 18,000 works of art from the Paleolithic age, that's more than 2000 BC, up to the 20th century, with numerous iconic paintings and sculpture by Spanish and Latin American masters, as well as superb examples from all areas of the decorative arts of the Hispanic world. The library, with over 250,000 manuscripts, 35,000 rare books, and 300,000 modern books, its renowned library serves as an essential resource for research into the arts, literature, history, and culture of Spain, Portugal, Latin America, and the Philippines. The collection of prints and photographs preserves an invaluable visual record of Hispanic cultural patrimony, with 17,000 prints from the 16th century to the 20th century and over 100,000 historical photographs ranging from Philippine daguerreotypes of the 1840s up to the Hispanic Society's photographic expeditions to Spain in the 1920s. Let me move on with some of the images here. We see the reading room, so you'll get some orientation on it, and the map by Vespucci is in the current exhibition. The Hispanic Society Museum and Library, located on Audubon Terrace in Upper Manhattan, was founded in 1904 by the American scholar and philanthropist Archer M. Huntington, born in 1870 and died in 1955. The Hispanic Society was founded as a free public museum and library to promote the study of the rich artistic and cultural traditions of Spain and its area of influence in the Americas and throughout the world. The collections are unrivaled in their scope and quality outside the Iberian Peninsula, addressing nearly every aspect of culture in Spain, as well as much of Portugal, Latin America, and the Philippines. The Hispanic Society is not only the preeminent art museum and library dedicated to Hispanic culture in the United States. It also serves as the sole institution uniting all of the Hispanic and Latino populations through their common heritage of the Spanish language, history, and culture. Archer Huntington's first exposure, the founder of the Hispanic Society, to the Spanish language occurred in Texas in the late 1870s from Mexican workers on the ranch of his aunt, Emma J. Yarrington Warnken, near San Marcos, Texas. But it was the purchase in Liverpool, England, of a book by George Borrow, the Sincali, or an account of the Gypsies in Spain, published in London in 1841, which was on his first trip to Europe in 1882, that ignited his lifelong passion for Spain and Hispanic culture. Visits on this trip to the National Gallery in London and to the Louvre in Paris proved to be life-changing experiences that instilled in him a profound love for art and museums. Following his visit to the National Gallery on the 12th of July, the 12-year-old wrote in his diary, "Read the catalog until I could not see any more and went to bed. I think a museum is the grandest thing in the world. I should like to live in one." It's remarkable to think that the experience of this trip would inspire a 12-year-old to create what is today the Hispanic Society of America. I should say that this was the exact time that Archer Huntington started keeping diaries, which he did throughout the rest of his life for the most part. He later on in life destroyed most of the diaries. So we only have fragments of them of what he decided to keep. But this provides valuable information on being able to trace the development of the institution and the history through his diaries and through the letters to his mother, who was a major influence. Archer Huntington was born Archer Milton Worsham in New York City on the 10th of March, 1870, weighing an impressive 11 pounds at birth. He grew up to be 6'5", and at one point or another weighed almost 300 pounds. He took the surname Huntington in 1884 when his mother, Arabella Duval Yarrington Worsham, who you see at the left, and that's the infant Archer, you can tell he was a big baby, married Collis Potter Huntington, the founder of the Central Pacific Railroad, which was the western spur of the Transcontinental Railroad, and the Newport News shipyards in Virginia. Arabella, along with Collis, built a very large art collection, and after his death, she built another collection on her own. What you see here is the library in her residence that she created before they were married, which was on 54th Street between 5th and 6th Avenues in New York City. She bought it in 1880, and between 1881 and 1882, she had one of the top interior design and furniture firms in New York City, which was run by George Shasty. It's not a household name. It's only been recently more documented, but they were one of the top 3 firms in that period in New York. And it was all custom interiors, and in fact, she spent $1 million in that period redecorating this entire house. It was a big sort of Victorian house on 54th Street, and when she took over that house, there was virtually nothing built north of it. Manhattan had only grown up to that point at that time. After her husband's death, she went on to form other collections, but what we see here, I'm going to show a few images, is one that she acquired following Collis's death, which she owned, the famous Rembrandt painting of Aristotle with a bust of Homer, which is now in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It was not a donation. Actually, it went to Archer Huntington after she died, and he sold it, and it went through several different owners before it finally was purchased by the Met. Another is Woman with a Lute by Vermeer, which was in Collis's collection, and that all of the things that were in the collection formed while he was alive were bequested to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And another final one is this was a work that was formed for the Huntington Museum in San Marino, California. She and Henry Huntington together built up a very large collection of English portraiture from the 18th century, as well as French decorative arts, and added also, she continued to collect some Dutch old master paintings in that period. On her death in 1924, most of the Collis and Arabella Huntington collections were donated to various museums, as I mentioned, including the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Museum of the California Palace of the Legion of Honor, which is now the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco, and the Huntington Library Art Collection and Botanical Gardens in San Marino, California. After 1882, after that momentous trip for Archer to England and France, he came back, and 2 years later already had a tutor at home to learn Spanish. So by the time he was in his teens, he was quite fluent in Spanish. And also, at that time, he really started collecting more and more books. In fact, it became obsessive. He wanted to collect all the books that he could find on Spanish history, literature, art. And in fact, in a matter of time, he had amassed over 2,000 books. He went on to start collecting, by the time he was in his mid-teens, rare books and manuscripts. His expertise had grown so much. And you have to keep in mind, this is all essentially self-taught. He never had a university degree in any of these areas. Then it was he traveled with his parents in 1889 to Mexico City. They went by train, of course, since Collis had rail lines that ran into Mexico, and then they took other trains down. And they dined with President Porfirio Diaz in Chapultepec Castle, and there were humorous episodes that occurred then that I can't go into now. There's not time. But it was the experience of that trip of being more immersed in a Spanish-speaking country that really made the decision final that Archer wanted to one day found a museum and library based on Hispanic culture. This had been something that had been brewing, that he'd been thinking about from his early teens, and it was this experience in Mexico that made it definitive, and he actually, back in New York, told his father that that's what he wanted to do. His father had wanted him to continue on in the family business. He was offering him management of the Newport News shipyards, but Archer really wanted to dedicate his life to Hispanic art and culture, and that's what he then proceeded to move on doing. He was determined from the very beginning to learn everything that he could about Spain before he ever traveled there. He had been to Europe already 3 times before he ever traveled to Spain, and that was finally in 1892 at the age of 20 and 21, because he was in Spain for a number of months. Once he returned, he married his cousin, and on that marriage, his father gave them a house in Baychester, in Westchester in the Bronx, and the house was on Long Island Sound. It was a big Victorian house, and with the marriage and the house, his father decided to give him a work that they had acquired in Paris a number of years earlier. I'm sure they already knew at that point of Archer's interest in Hispanic art and culture, and this was not a work that really fit into Collis and Arabella's collection, and it was purchased just to be a gift to the son at the right time. And it is a very important painting. It's by Antonis More, who was one of the great artists in the mid-16th century. This is the great Duke of Alba, which has great historical significance because this was the Duke that made the Alba family famous, gave them their power and their wealth, and he is the one that tried to suppress Protestantism in the Low Countries during the Spanish Wars there. Archer went on, once he had Plaisance, to construct an entire wing to house his library. The photo we see here is roughly on, I was just trying to think of what year we were at. It's around 1900 or so. It's a little bit after that, which is datable because a few of the archaeological pieces that are on view in the photograph. But you can tell he had his whole system worked out. He studied other libraries. He designed it so that the walls were shelves for the books, and hung what works he had acquired at that time, which are, except for the archaeological items, it's mostly reproductive works. Anything that looks like a painting is a reproduction, and the tapestries were just generic decoration. They're not necessarily Spanish. But he created the library in the fashion that he wanted at that time. In 1902, Collis had died in 1900, and in 1902, he had greater resources and acquired the most important private library in Spain. It belonged to Manuel Pérez de Guzmán y Bossa, who was the Marquis of Jerez de los Caballeros. He had an identical twin brother who also had a major library, but the Serclais is the one that had a library that was focused on literature and had some very important manuscripts included, but it was mostly rare books. That gave him enough of a core for a library now to really seriously think about founding the Hispanic Society, which is what he proceeded to do. And in 1904, Huntington founded the Hispanic Society of America, purchased land on the west side of Broadway between 155th and 156th Streets, and immediately began construction. And here we see it just a year into the construction. The land that he purchased is now all Audubon Terrace. He eventually invited other institutions to move up there. We really wish he had just left all the land for us, though, but that's not the way things worked out. And we could really use it for expansion. But you can see that there was a large Victorian house that was still on the property. In fact, there were a couple that were there for a few years, even after the building went up. And the original entrance was off of 156th Street, up through stairs, and today that's all closed off, and the entrance is now from Broadway itself. Over time, as he was building the institution, the library of the Marqués de Jerez de los Caballeros gave him a major library that would be an essential source for research for many scholars over time. But that in itself wasn't enough, and Huntington kept collecting and collecting and collecting. And the library's, really the bulk of the library's collection of rare books and manuscripts was formed in a period of less than 10 years. Between 1905 and 1914, he bought exclusively from a German antiquarian book dealer named Karl Hirsemann. And Hirsemann would put together entire catalogs of Hispanic material. It could be Spain, it could be Latin America, it could be the Philippines, various areas, and Huntington would buy the entire catalog at a significant discount. Huntington really felt that he had found the ideal way to build a major collection as quickly as possible, and it was almost too successful because after 9 years, and this is where also in 1914, when he stopped collecting, it was getting to the point that the war was beginning to break out in Europe, and it was sort of time to quit because in the case of rare books, he was already acquiring way too many duplicates that would have to go back in these Hirsemann purchases. But essentially, in 1914, that was the end of his collecting for rare books and manuscripts. He had already amassed so much material, essentially he didn't really even know what all was in the library at that point, and the librarians took decades to catalog just the rare books, and the manuscripts were left basically with the cataloging provided by Hirsemann's own catalogs. The building was completed in 1906 and opened to the public in 1908. The Huntington's collecting for the museum really did not get going until about 1904 when he founded the museum. So essentially, all of the museum collections were formed between 1904, at least Huntington's acquisitions, and the latest would be the late 20s or 1930, thereabouts. But the bulk of the early collections in the museum were all acquired really before 1920, and Huntington was buying extensively and aggressively. Sometimes people don't realize that you can't just put a shopping list together and go out and buy it when it comes to art. It has to be on the market. You have to find it. You have to be there at the right time. And Huntington, as much as anything, was very lucky to be there at the right time because he traveled to Europe every year. Not necessarily to Spain. He always went to London and Paris and Biarritz, and sometimes traveled over to Germany, sometimes traveled to Italy. But by the time after the founding of the Hispanic Society, by that time, he was well known enough in Spain that he was hounded by everybody to try and sell him something. So he really sort of avoided going to Spain any more than he had to in later years. The very first major work that he purchased on his own was the portrait of Camilo Estali, known as Cardinal Pamphili by Velázquez. And it was probably one of his biggest bargains, because when it was purchased, Velázquez was not, this is very early on in the interest of collecting paintings by Velázquez, which are rare in their own right, just because most of his works still are in Spain. And he purchased this as a group of paintings from Francis Lathrop, who was a British painter who lived in New York, had done some of the paintings in his mother's Fifth Avenue mansion after she had moved out of the other house we had seen. And Archer had known him for a number of years, and Francis Lathrop convinced him to buy a lot of about 10 or 12 paintings. The only one of which ultimately that really proved to be an exceptional painting is this Velázquez, but he hit a home run at least with this one. This was acquired through a Paris dealer named Trotti in 1904. He then went on in 1904 to buy this work from Francis Lathrop, which is also an exceptional work, but it was just these two works that were of significance. There were a lot of other portraits that didn't really quite pan out ultimately over time. When Huntington had, in 1898, before founding the Hispanic Society, he had carried out for a few brief months excavations at the Roman site of Italica, which is near Seville. The modern city is called Santi Ponce, and it was there that he took over excavations that were already being carried out by a German archaeologist, and he managed to excavate some significant Roman sculptures, all of which were given to the Archaeological Museum in Seville, and did manage to excavate a large number of Roman ceramics and glass objects, which did stay in the Hispanic Society's collection. But at that time, in 1898, he met another individual, a Frenchman named George Bonser, who was a professional archaeologist. He actually had been trained as an archaeologist, and he was really one of the first professional archaeologists that documented his work properly in Spain. And he worked around a city to the southeast of Seville called Carmona. And Bonser became good friends with Huntington. Huntington became a patron, and for Bonser, the purchases that Huntington made from Bonser's excavations gave Bonser the money to continue his excavations. And Huntington also managed to publish the research of Bonser on many of his most important excavations, one related to the Bell Beaker culture, other related to Phoenician ivory or bone pieces that were found, works in bone that were like boxes and combs that he had unearthed. And there was a very fruitful relationship with those two that went on for a couple of decades. This is some examples of Bell Beaker pottery. These were acquired in 1905 from Bonser. It's basically the bowl and a pedestal in the center and the bowl on the right. The rest of the Bell Beaker acquisitions were carried out a few years later, around 1910. And the Hispanic Society, through those pieces acquired from Bonser, actually has sort of the finest representative collection of Spanish Bell Beaker pottery in the world. Most people are not familiar with the Bell Beaker culture. It's not that well known, but they were actually the first ceramics-based culture that produced decorated ceramics. They started out on the coast of Portugal, moved north all the way to the British Isles, were even around Stonehenge, and went as far east as Germany. And they were the culture that introduced copper smelting in all those areas in Europe. So they really had a profound influence, but in Spain, their ceramics are far more decorative. That's where they produce this burnished blackware with dramatic white incised decoration that's filled with basically a bone paste, ashes from bones. Huntington continued with antiquities from the very beginning. In his late teens, he already had worked out a list of what he thought he should have in a museum and library, and it all went by periods and types of objects, and he basically went along over time sort of ticking things off of that list. Sometimes he was satisfied with one work, that filled a category. Other times he bought extensively in one area. In the case of archaeological items, he really liked that area, and basically the Hispanic Society has the largest collection outside of Spain of Spanish archaeological material. A lot of his purchases of some of the most important pieces were actually carried out in Paris. And between about 1904 and 5 and 1914, he bought actively from dealers and at auction in Paris. From other places, he also, because of his London travels, he bought heavily from one dealer in London, which was Lionel Harris, who had the Spanish Art Gallery. And the tombs of the Duchess of Albuquerque and the Bishop of Palencia, both from the same church in San Francisco de Cuellar, which is in the area province of Segovia, were acquired through Lionel Harris at the Spanish Art Gallery. The tombs are complete, but when Huntington acquired them, the buildings had already been built and there was no way to reconstruct them vertically, so they're compressed into a very tight space, relatively speaking, but both tombs, if they were to be completely reconstructed, go up over 30 feet high. And what we have used for the traveling exhibition is the effigy figure, which is one of the finest elements of the Duchess of Albuquerque, which is by a renowned Spanish late Gothic sculptor, Sirois. Another acquisition from the Spanish Art Gallery, also in 1906, is this 15th century chasuble, which is a very fine example in its own right, but curiously enough, there was a lot of serendipity in some of Huntington's acquisitions, because this chasuble relates to a Paris Bible from the 13th century that had belonged to the brother of St. Vincent Ferrer for the translation of the Valencian Bible. And this chasuble probably had been worn by Ferrer's brother at the Cistercian monastery in Valencia. And the translation of the Bible did go on, took place, and in another manuscript we acquired, the only surviving page of that Bible exists, which has the colophon and the printer's information. The Bible was not permitted by the church at that time to be translated into vernacular languages, so the entire edition was suppressed and destroyed, and all that survives is that one page. The Fine Immaculate by Carreño de Miranda, who was one of Spain's major painters after Velázquez, was acquired in Paris from the Sedlmayr Gallery in 1906. Huntington bought a large number of paintings from Sedlmayr around that time earlier on, and ended up sending almost all of them back because they weren't what they really should be. And this is one of the few that he kept out of that large purchase. But this one is a very interesting work, and it's signed and dated 1670. But this work was commissioned for a church in Mexico and spent most of its life there up until the end of the viceregal period, up until independence. And then belonged to a private family in Mexico and made its way to Europe, and ultimately was sold to Huntington for Sedlmayr. But this painting served as the prototype for a painting of an Immaculate Conception in the 17th century in Mexico, and there are 3 or 4 paintings known by major Mexican artists of that period copying the composition from this one work. The last of his early acquisitions from before the opening of the Hispanic Society are all from around 1908, and some of the most important. In fact, the most important painting in the collection, probably, and the most iconic for the Hispanic Society's holdings, is this portrait of the Duchess of Alba by Goya, which dates from 1797. And in fact, is a landmark painting. It's one of his finest portraits, but it also sort of marks a change in his style, because he had produced another portrait of the Duchess of Alba only 2 years earlier in 1795, which the Alba family still owns. That painting, however, looks like a stiff 18th century Spanish portrait, and there's a remarkable change in his style and technique just in those 2 or 3 years after painting that one painting. At that same time, he also was buying in New York. He bought a lot of paintings from the Eric Gallery in New York, also bought some Spanish lusterware, and he bought this very fine painting by Zurbarán of Saint Emerentiana. We have two saints, female saints by Zurbarán in the collection, and this is definitely the finest one. For years, this was identified as Saint Rufina rather than Saint Emerentiana, which is a much more obscure saint, so to speak, because of a confusion over what she was holding on top of the prayer book or Bible that she's holding. It was believed to be maybe some lumps of clay because Saint Rufina was a potter. Well, no, they're rocks, and Saint Emerentiana is the patron saint of Teruel, and she was stoned to death, so that's why the rocks are on top of the Bible. The Hispanic Society has one of the greatest collections in the world of Spanish lusterware. Huntington loved it. He collected it extensively. He wasn't alone. There was a major competition among lots of major collectors in the late 19th, early 20th century for Spanish lusterware, which included William Randolph Hearst and Spanish collectors and English collectors. But Huntington was, again, sort of in the right place at the right time. And Jacques Seligman in Paris had acquired a large, important collection, which included some with impeccable provenance. This bowl and two others in the exhibition that are to the left of this one in the displays had belonged to the collection of Baron Gustav de Rothschild, which was one of the most famous collectors of lusterware in that period. So Huntington, immediately advanced tenfold the quality of his collection of lusterware, and it went on to where he ultimately acquired over 100 pieces. We have not acquired a new piece of lusterware in over 100 years, basically. There was a pause somewhat after this with the opening of the Hispanic Society, but he didn't even wait but a few months, and he was back off to Europe. And in London, he saw on exhibition the works of Joaquin Sorolla at the Grafton Galleries. He clearly was impressed with him. He did not put any remarks in his diary, which has frustrated people forever. But he was so impressed with what he saw, and he thought it was so much what he wanted to present to the American public, showing them the people and customs of Spain, that he immediately had agents contact Sorolla to organize an exhibition in New York in 1909. He had already promised the first exhibition at the Hispanic Society to Ignacio Zuluaga, but Sorolla was so enthusiastic, put it all together so quickly, and promised to bring so many works. It was something like 300 oil paintings were brought, almost 100 small oil sketches, and that Huntington bumped up the time for the exhibition to February of 1909, and this shows the main court in the Hispanic Society in 1909 with the Sorolla exhibition installed. Huntington had to empty the main building with everything that was in it, and had to be able to hang and display all of the works that Sorolla brought. The exhibition was a monumental success. It was the most successful art exhibition in New York up to that time. It was only open for 1 month, and it attracted 160,000 visitors in February 1909, which is the middle of winter, snow and ice, cold. The museum had to be open for as much as 16 hours a day to accommodate all the visitors. They sold 50 or 60,000 catalogs and 2 or 3 printings, and unlike museums today, the works were for sale. So pretty much everything in the exhibition was for sale. Huntington bought the best works out of the exhibition for himself and for the Hispanic Society. Others bought dozens of works. The sales were huge. In fact, he sold something like 60% of everything that he had brought. And that money made Sorolla sufficiently wealthy that he then, on his return to Spain, built the house that's now today the Sorolla Museum. He received dozens and dozens of commissions. He couldn't fulfill all of them for portraits. And Huntington arranged for another exhibition in 1911. I'll just show a few of the works. You saw this in the background on the upper mezzanine of the galleries. This is Soroya's Beaching the Boat from 1903. It's one of his most important works. If not, you could argue it's his most important work because it's the first painting that he felt that he had been able to capture the effect of light on water that he'd been trying to for years. And Soroya, since he's known as the painter of light, this has profound significance in his painting, and it's from this point on that his work changes, and his most brilliant period is between basically 1903 and 1913 as far as his individual works that he was selling. One of his most famous paintings also is After the Bath, which was acquired for the Hispanic Society, as well as a number of other paintings like Sea Idol. That exhibition's success and some of the people that actually acquired works in it, Louis Comfort Tiffany, for example, purchased 5 paintings, I believe, out of that exhibition, and ultimately commissioned a portrait from Soroya, which he did when he returned in 1911. And this is the great portrait of Louis Comfort Tiffany, which is the primary portrait that that was displayed in Tiffany's own home. This was painted in situ at Laurelton Hall in Oyster Bay on Long Island Sound. And it's really a glorious portrait. It has to be the most beautiful portrait that Soroya ever made. And this stayed with Tiffany until his death. It passed on in the family. And in 1950, there was not an interest in one of his daughters to necessarily keep the painting in the family, and it was donated to the Hispanic Society. What people may not realize is after the 1920s, Tiffany fell out of favor, Soroya fell out of favor. Their works weren't considered of any great worth, and there wasn't much interest in them. So that's not something that would happen today. This is probably one of the most valuable paintings by Soroya if it were ever to come on the market, because the Tiffany collectors, if nothing else, would go crazy over it. That 1909 exhibition also led Huntington to think about doing a special commission for the Hispanic Society, an entire room with paintings. This was brought up with Soroya as early as 1910. Huntington had in mind a series of historical paintings with a whole series of portraits of the famous individuals from Spain, historical figures from the earliest civilizations up to the 20th century, running around sort of as a frieze below the historical paintings. Well, Soroya really didn't like that idea. It meant research, and he was not that sort of a painter. So he came back and proposed to Huntington a series of paintings on the provinces of Spain, which is what we see here. And the commission was signed in Paris in 1900 for $150,000, which was a monumental sum for a living artist for a commission. And Soroya spent the next 8 years of his life painting these in Spain. He traveled all over Spain. He found locations that he thought best represented what he wanted to portray. And so most of them, except for the painting of Castile, which is the largest and most complicated, we see a fragment of it there on the far right. These are all individual scenes taken in different countries, and you can, even from this photo, tell the different tonalities of light in the paintings. One of the brightest, and it's because of the location, is Ayamonte, the painting right in the center with the tuna harvest. And that one is the last painting that was completed in 1919. Unfortunately, Soroya never saw these paintings installed anywhere. He kept them rolled in his studio in Madrid. He had a stroke in 1920 and died 3 years later and was never able to paint again. So these were not installed in the Hispanic Society until they were shipped over before Soroya died. But the gap, because of Archer's mother's death, Arabella, in 1924, basically the gallery was not inaugurated until 1925, and by that point didn't attract much interest in the New York world. The other exhibition that was planned for 1909 was Ignacio Zuluaga, which took place after the Soroya exhibition. Zuluaga brought many fewer works, but Huntington managed to acquire really the best ones out of the exhibition, and the paintings by Zuluaga from this period and a few years earlier are actually his best work and all the things. Here we have the family of the Gypsy bullfighter. Zuluaga didn't, this is not Soria would have painted an actual family of a Gypsy bullfighter. This is a composed painting in the case of Zuluaga. And who we have here is his mother is seated in the middle, and his cousin Candida is standing on the right in that sort of acid green dress. And the bullfighter is an actor and so on and so forth. But he was wanting to sort of create certain images of traditional Spain. Here's another that was one of his most successful works. It won the prize in the Paris Salon in 1908. It was a painting done of Lucien Breval, the famous opera singer, performing as Carmen in the Paris Opera. She did go on to perform Carmen in the Paris Opera, but it was a year later. So this actually predates her performance, but he did design sets for that production, and which essentially dictated the way the opera was presented in that case. But it's really one of his finest works, and is really one of the most successful. Huntington had acquired the one Velázquez in 1904. In 1909, Joseph Duveen in Paris had acquired a very famous collection of old masterworks, the Kahn Collection. He acquired the entire collection at a cost of over $3 million. And really needed to sell a lot of this stuff fast, and he managed to sell a lot of it fast through Arabella Huntington, because she bought most of the French decorative arts, the 18th century furniture, and other paintings. And this painting was not necessarily for her collection, but she thought it belonged in the Hispanic Society, so she paid close to half of the money down to Duveen, and then she told Archer to pay for the rest of it. Well, it was way more than he had ever considered paying for any painting, and refused to do it. And this drug on for months, and finally she hounded him enough that he finally gave in, and Duveen lowered the price, and Archer paid the other half of what she had paid. So this phenomenal painting, one of the few personal works by Velázquez that remained in his studio until his death. It appears in the inventory, or what is believed to be this painting. It's thought maybe that it's a granddaughter. That's how this came to be in the collection. A year later, Arabella found that a major work by Velázquez, a large painting of the Count Duke of Olivares, was available in a British collection. This also came through Duveen, who was her favorite dealer. She bought almost everything from him. And when she purchased this in 1910 to give to the Hispanic Society in memory of Collis Potter Huntington, she paid $650,000 for it. If you can understand what the world was like then, you can multiply that by about 100. So $65 million is more or less what it would have been worth in today's dollars. It was a phenomenal sum, and it actually set the record for what the most anyone had ever paid for a painting, and that record survived until after World War I. So we're lucky to have this work. It's been in the collection all that time, and most of the early works like the Velázquez were never loaned up until 10 years ago or so, but since we've loaned them on a number of occasions. So everyone in Houston has an opportunity to see all three of the Velázquez paintings in the Hispanic Society's collection, which is a remarkable number for any U.S. institution. Other works that he acquired, Luis de Morales was the major Spanish painter in the mid-16th century, specialized in altars, and all oils on panel. We have three works in the collection at the Hispanic Society. The Met only acquired their first painting by Morales a couple of years ago. The El Grecos also, Huntington was buying, in some cases as many as he could. He couldn't resist buying another El Greco. He bought El Grecos into the 1920s, so that today the Hispanic Society has some that are just period works that are maybe studio, but we do have 7 works that are all by El Greco. This is a fairly rare work from when he was in Italy before going to Spain, the Pita, and this one of the portrait miniature of a man was acquired in Paris in 1912 from a somewhat unusual dealer. It's a long story, but it was a woman who lived in New York who was sort of more of a picker than a dealer, and she had somehow negotiated to acquire this work and met with Huntington and managed to sell it to him in Paris in 1912. But it's an extremely rare work. It is signed on the back by El Greco, and it's on essentially a thin cardboard. Huntington also bought extensively in the way of Spanish polychrome sculpture. The Hispanic Society has the largest collection in the world of terracottas by Luis Roldan. We have 5. There are 2 other sculptural groups like this that are temporarily on exhibition in the Met in their galleries, while our museum is undergoing renovations. This is the sort of work that we really considered not really something that could travel, but this is the least fragile of the 3 that we have of the sculptural groups. So this was included in the exhibition because she's such an important sculptor, the very first major woman sculptor in Spain. And this dates from between 1692 to 1706, when she was the royal sculptor living in Madrid. And at that time, all those years, all she worked in was terracotta. And the last one is the most modern work that Huntington ever acquired. He only liked representational art. He did not like modern art in that period, Picasso, etc., Juan Greco. And this was as out there as Huntington got in his day. He bought this out of Anglada Camarasa's studio in 1912, I believe. And this is essentially the most modern work that he ever acquired. He went on to get a group of Goya drawings in 1913 from the Spanish painter Raimundo de Madrazo, whose studio was in Paris. And it's a great group of drawings in the fact that it represents sort of all periods of Goya's career in doing drawings. Another one bought from Madrazo at the same time is the Alhambra silk. In fact, all of our Islamic textiles were acquired in one purchase from Raimundo de Madrazo at that time. And almost the same year, 1913, in London, he acquired the ivory pyxis from Medina Asara by Khalaf, which dates from the 10th century, which is really one of the finest examples of Islamic art that exists and the finest Spanish ivory. Now, Huntington, as I said, his collection sort of ceased after World War I. He filled in some old master paintings into the collection. He bought some other contemporary works. Decorative arts he really wasn't buying in that period, and he became less active with the Hispanic Society after 1930. He was 60 years old. He was tired of running a museum. It took up all of his time. And he sort of went into a semi-retirement and really didn't do that much more actively with the museum. So after 1930, most of the things that entered the collections were gifts, either from Huntington, works that he had held back from earlier acquisitions, and in some cases from a few other individuals. And the Hispanic Society did not have the funds for active acquisitions, even in that period. So it really wasn't until well after Huntington's death in 1955 that the Hispanic Society again started acquiring things on their own through acquisitions, and that started in the late 60s. But there were limited resources, and it's really not until the last 15, 20 years that we've had more funds available for acquisitions. And it's that time when we've added significant works to the museum collections in the way of polychrome sculpture, such as the Pedro de Mena Saint Asisclus, which is a phenomenal work in its own right, but it's really one of his most realistic works. And it's one of the few works where you can sort of say that he actually created someone's portrait. Saint Asisclus did not have a fixed iconography, so he was free to use any individual he wanted. And the two Saints Martha and Magdalene, Mary Magdalene by Juan de Juni were actually just acquired in 2018. This is probably one of the most recent major acquisitions. Juan de Juni was Spain's most important Renaissance sculptor in the mid-19th century. Since that time, we've also, in these last 25 years, we've built up almost all in its entirety the Latin American collections from that are on view in the exhibition. The books and manuscripts were acquired by Huntington. A few other pieces, maybe a couple other pieces here and there were already in the collection, but all the paintings, all the decorative arts for the most part, all have been acquired in the last 25 years. There's a great painting by Rodriguez Juarez, a cast painting. This is the very first series of cast paintings that were produced around 1715 for the Viceroy Linares in Mexico. A phenomenal polychrome panel of St. James the Moorslayer that dates to the late 16th century. A painting of a type known as enconchado that is unique to Mexico. The technique calls for putting a canvas over board, building up a resinous medium to embed fragments of mother of pearl into, and then the artist paints on top of it. Most of the enconchado paintings that are encrusted with mother of pearl have larger segments that do not vary within the composition as they do here, and it's really just sort of central figures have large chunks of mother of pearl, and the artist is painted on top of them. But Nicolas de Correa brought it to a new level that no one else ever exceeded, and that was in matching the size of pieces in the composition, where you get a distinction in the floor of the tiles or stone that's in the floor, the silver vessels that are in the upper portion of the painting, as well as in the textiles of the individuals. We were really lucky to acquire probably one of the greatest Latin American portraits from the 19th century a few years ago, which is Arrieta's El Costeño, or the Young Man from the Coast. It's a truly iconic painting of an African Mexican that there's just nothing else like it. And unfortunately, there are very few paintings like this that exist from Mexico prior to the 20th century, mostly because a lot of times they're more what they called costumbrista scenes, which put people in rather stereotypical settings, as was done in the United States in the 19th century also. This one is a major painting by Sebastiano Lopez de Dialga, painted in Mexico around 1650, and it is signed. You can't see it here, but it's signed on the left about almost halfway up the painting. It's a very important work that was totally unknown when we acquired it at auction in Madrid. And it's based on an engraving by Lucas Voorsterman after a painting by Sir Peter Paul Rubens. The original Rubens was destroyed in a fire in the 18th century, so the real record of that painting exists through copies and the engravings. But here it really shows the great mastery of Arteaga, which had not really been realized before until this painting, of his absolute mastery of human anatomy. As you can see, these wreathing group of fallen angels with the devil below St. Michael. St. Sebastian by Alonso Vasquez is also another work that was painted in Mexico. Vasquez was a painter that was well established in Seville, but traveled as the painter to a new viceroy. And his work, as did with all the other Spanish painters that went to Latin America, their work changes once they get there. And he had painted another St. Sebastian in Seville 2 years before he left, a year before he left for Mexico, and this painting really has very little to do with the other one he had done, so it definitively has to be from there. There were great sculptors in Ecuador in the 18th century. One is Legarda, the other one is Caspicata, and we were lucky just a few years ago to acquire this phenomenal set of the Four Fates of Man, the different souls, by Caspicata, which is really one of the most striking groups of polychrome wood sculpture you could find from anywhere in that period. And this one is really one of the most recent acquisitions, with St. Michael, Archangel Triumphant over Satan, by Luis Juarez, which was one of the major Mexican painters from the mid-17th, from the 1630s. And Vasquez influenced generations after he was there. Juarez influenced generations, and so did Arteaga. So we have three consecutive major artists now in the collection of where they had moved on, where their influence was felt throughout essentially all the 17th century. And that basically concludes how the collection essentially has been put together over the years. But in its entirety, between the holdings in the library, the great importance of all the works there, particularly manuscripts, there's enough unpublished manuscript material for people to work for 1,000 years on that. And the museum's collections are so comprehensive that it's really the only place where you can go to research a complete survey of 4,000 years of the works of art and decorative arts and literature and culture from Spain all the way to the Philippines. So I hope this maybe gives you a little more information on what you see in the exhibition, and I hope you enjoy it and hope you buy a catalog.